What is up, everyone? Carmen with Pittsburgh White Shorts coming at you with something a little bit different this time. These competitive theory videos have been doing pretty well, so I wanted to take a crack at another one, and today I wanted to talk about how bad is a limit 2 restriction really? There's been a lot of discussion about mostly Gura, since that's the hot topic in English, just how much playing a deck with a limit 2 restriction is a liability or not, and I just wanted to get into my take as to why. So I want to start out with a couple of caveats here. We're going to be talking about tier 2 plus events here exclusively. So we're going to be talking about deck building for shop challenges and up. So shop challenges, regionals, and farther. Any deck can really take 3 to 4 rounds at your locals, just take a couple rounds here and there. We're really trying to target that X1 to X2 floor, because the goal whenever we travel out to tournaments is to at least make top 8. That is our absolute floor. We want to make it into top 8 so that we can push for that top placing, qualify for worlds, etc., etc. And because we are targeting to make top 8 with a deck that we bring to these events, we are going to ruthlessly optimize them. Building decks just to make them work again after restrictions is a lot different than building the deck to experience the same amount of success that it had pre-ban. So we're going to be a little bit more stringent here when we're talking about how much things are going to affect our deck, extrapolating over a lot of rounds and things like that. Other big thing here, confirmation bias, especially in a game like White's where it's best of 1, it's pretty hard to break through. There's always going to be exceptions and breakout performances. People can always have a hot streak. Obviously, the decks work, even if they aren't super optimized. We see stuff like that time and time again, so we're going to try to be as objective as possible. We're mostly only going to talk about finishers. Limits on utility cards are very different. And of course, this is just my take. You can agree or disagree, and if you do, let me know down in the comments. So the first thing you're going to want to do after a limit 2 gets hit on your finisher is assessing just how bad that hit was. So was playing 3 to 4 of that card the good part, right? So with Gura, you got that insane reach with 3 copies on the board. 360 no-scope people almost from level 1, like 1/6, things like that. It's an absolutely crazy amount of damage because each Gura, if everything goes through, represents 7 damage. 3 Guras, maximum of 21. Pretty crazy before triggers and things like that. Looking at a card like Kurumi, 4 copies for her was really important because that was a standby deck. So the more copies, more easily having her in waiting room to come out with standby, more chances to have that modular decompression go off with multiple instances, especially being able to do it early because she had those different effects that could sort of catch you in a deck state that no other card could, because with the combination of the shuffle back, the stock swap, and the burn could leave you with a deck with no cards. So having multiple copies of her was not only good for easily putting her out on the board early with standby, but also giving you more opportunities to have that sort of modular decompression, crazy stuff go off. And then something like Aki, right? And Chainsaw Man, because Aki is a Icy Tail where the damage isn't guaranteed, even though he gets to check a ton of cards for each instance, being able to play all 3 Akis because they salvaged and was easily able to get multiple copies out on the board. You mitigated the variance of that finisher by just playing more and more copies, because you could check so many cards with the easy revenge event. So by having more copies and multiples, you mitigated the finisher variance, so it always seemed better than a normal Icy Tail would. Like I briefly mentioned, it's a lot different when we're looking at utility cards versus something like a finisher. There's a major difference in costs and use versus finishers. And even a limit 1, depending on the context, can still be really good for utility cards. Something like Henology's Merlin, which actually just came off, which is limit 1 in JP. Or something like Shiny Colors Hiyori, if you can get that into the field. You have multiple ways to search that card and easily dump it, and after you get 1 on the board, you're pretty much good to go and don't need any more of it. It's a lot easier because that's sort of a standby deck. There's a lot of context at play here, but utility cards, a lot different than finishers. Finishers having exponential power and multiples in their field. The other big question when you're talking about your hit is, was one of your decks that utilized that card frequently only presenting 2 copies? 1k1 Gura variants are a really big proponent of this, and this is why you still see so much discourse about it. Are we still able to play Gura decks because we only really aim to put 2 to the board, versus decks that really tried to have that full board, something like Aki, where Aki, salvage, you know, getting out that full board, versus something like 1k1 Gura, Kali Gura, where you mostly just slam 2 and win for as hard as you could. So just general issues with playing limit 2, gonna get into some of these. And again, remember, we're aiming at tier 2 plus events, and we're going to be very ruthless in how we're optimizing here. So there's a really big difference between only fielding 2 versus only playing 2 total. The consistency of naturally acquiring 2 copies of a card drops a lot when you can only play 2 of it. And zone loss, so like stuff like a card going to clock or being triggered on first attack, goes from just an annoying thing that happens in Weiss to a catastrophic fail case. You're only playing 2 of a card, trigger 1 first attack. That's even worse than triggering a climax. You got to pay that card out because you need to be able to field 2 of it, or your finisher turn just doesn't have the reach that it otherwise would have, isn't going to be as effective. The big thing against this that you hear everybody say all the time is I will just search it. There's a problem with I will just search it. There's a lot, and you got to consider the associated costs. The obvious one is the resource thresholds increase, right? If you're going to play a drop search to get a card, you're going to drop salvage, thing of that nature. That increases your overall stock threshold for your finisher because you have to add in those tutor costs. The other big downside is that gripping those cards, if you naturally draw them, you're going to hard grip that Gura because you only have 2, means that you're playing on a -1 to -2 card hand for the rest of the game. While that doesn't seem like a big deal when you just talk about it, especially over the course of the game, depending on the style of deck that you're playing, whether your cards stay on board or whether you expect your cards to die and need to be replaced, that tax over the course of a game, over the course of many games, over the course of a long event, really starts to hit the general consistency of your strategy. And then adding in those additional filter cards to search can sometimes needlessly limit our deck space, so we're not able to play decks that maybe target the meta versus having to play all those filter cards to make sure that we will just search the cards. And like I mentioned, you got to extrapolate all these issues over the expected 11 or so rounds that you got to play at a regional these days to make it through the whole tournament. Like I said, when you're just looking at locals, where you're only playing 3 to 4, maybe 5 rounds at best, it's not as easy to see these issues. You can easily have an event where you run hot, don't think about it, and you're like, oh, deck's still great, deck's still running. You got to test a lot more data tracking because you're going to have to target those 11 round super long grindy tournaments. And then after you have all that data, it's just like, okay, can the deck still function under these constraints? The answer is usually yes. A limit 2 isn't that bad. The deck's still going to play, but the main thing you want to hit on is, can the deck still succeed under those constraints? Are we hitting that same power target, same or similar power target that the deck hit previously, so that it can still be a meta threat? So a great example to talk about is obviously Gura, because 1k1 Gura was an efficient damage trading deck that regularly only slammed down double of its finisher at endgame and just tried to finish the game from there after slamming over and over and over with a bunch of soul triggers, keeping a generally high damage output, taking the game very quickly, and ending the game with 2 of still a very powerful finisher. So how do those constraints that we just talked about affect this specific strategy of 1k1 Gura choice pants Kali Gura? The big one is going to be less turn-to-turn flexibility. Because you got to grip those 2 Guras, you're at a 5-card hand max, you're a deck that has to refill its board every single turn. Your cards are very, very rarely going to live, even though Kali can hold her power cross turn. The chance that those cards live, very, very low, even in the modern meta, and even more so post-ban, since now we have Nino running around. So being expected to refill your board every single turn, having to death grip those cards, means that playing on that 5-card max could be an issue. Having to add more filter to the deck, as Gura was a deck that just kind of just slammed max copies of all its important cards, especially because it needs to maximize that soul trigger count, means that having to include those filters is going to impact our overall card choices. A flimsier level 0 overall, just by a little bit. Hololive is pretty resilient at level 0, but you're going to have less space for other threats. And in combination with the 5-card hand max issue, since you're having to grip those Guras, means that we aren't going to be able to play other threats. The other big thing about Gura, since 1k1 Gura was a deck that really wanted to take the game quickly, is that zone loss, losing a card to clock or stalk early, is exacerbated by that faster tempo. So quicker games mean that if you trigger that Gura on first attack at level 1, that means you either got a -3 stock kneecapped finisher turn, or you got to pay all the way down to it, pay it out, and then gamble that you're going to get that extra turn back later. If you pump the brakes and you're not slamming your opponent as quickly as possible, you're not taking advantage of what the deck did great. Gura is obviously a incredible part of that deck and the centerpiece of it, but the fact that you were able to efficiently slam over and over and over and constantly put out a minimum of 2 soul in pretty much every lane starting from your first turn was really strong. Taking a turn where you got to pay all the way down to get out one of these only 2 Guras that you triggered on first attack means that your finisher turn isn't going to be anywhere near good as it used to be, and you're probably set behind by a turn because you had to pump the brakes. Lose that 3 stock there means that you basically lose an entire turn of resource generation just to get that card out of your stock. So to look a little bit more specifically here, we're going to look at 2 versions of Gura, pre and post ban. This is Steve's World's Gura, from Steve from the Refresh Point, and our current world champion. As we can see, it's got that core in there. Anything that's not highlighted is pretty much the core of the deck. I have these cards outlined in red, which are the cards that the post-ban version can't exactly play, and then a couple cards highlighted in blue, which have equivalents. Aren't really important, but everything else that isn't highlighted is what you consider quote-unquote core to the deck. We got our Callies, our Brainstorms with soul triggers, our Kanata for exchanging our hand resources for extra stock to ensure that we can get that double finisher turn. We got our Kanata Search Rickies to make sure that we always get our Callie turn online to process our deck and get us into that good refresh. All that good stuff that we have come to know 1K1 Gura for. And of course, those 4 Ina Climax swaps, not only with their soul trigger in the top right corner, but the ability to switch off that pants trigger into the Callie Climax to keep slamming, keep generating card advantage, and move towards your finisher turn in an efficient manner. But if we look at this version, this post-ban version put together by Riaz, he recently put out a video on it. He's been putting out a lot of videos. I will link both Riaz's channel and the Refresh Point in the description. Both are amazing channels that you should check out. Riaz put out this video saying that Gura is still doing pretty okay. And I don't completely agree, because there's a couple reasons here that means that I would never be bringing Gura to a big event. And let's just go over briefly why. The big thing you're going to notice, number 1, no tap counter. The main reason that we can't play tap counter is because we have to death grip those 2 Guras. We got to ditch 5 overall cards, 4 plus the counter itself, to fire off that tap. 1K1 Gura, honestly, even in the past when you got to play 4, you could throw your whole goddamn hand and still get off a double Gura turn with a draw, a clock, and a brainstorm or something like that. It was really, really disgusting, and one of the dumbest things that Hololive could really do. The fact that you could play this super aggressive strategy and your opponent still had to at least acknowledge and play around the fact that you could tap counter and still do a crazy finisher. But now that we got a death grip, these Guras, we can't really play tap counter anymore. And that's a really big blow to just the threat of the deck. Other big thing is that we had that 2-3 split of off finishers, the Callie and the Noelle being an Icy Tail, the Callie being a Musashi, and these were just efficient, different threats. The Noelle also was able to answer boards for possible standby, was able to hedge against standby Pants Slime, which was pretty popular at Worlds this year. It was a good meta call. But we had to take those slots and play a worse package to kind of shore up the fact that we don't have 4 full Guras. So we have this IMA and Choco. The Choco can free summon a card from your hand, so it can shore up the fact that, you got to play that Gura. You have that tight stock threshold because you're going pretty quickly. You just don't want to play at a whole board of level 3s. So you get to free summon a Gura, or maybe this IMA, which is a double level down. Sort of a good hedge against Nino in the same way that Noelle in the previous version, although that was, pre-summer premium booster, so you also got to keep that in mind. Pretty good hedge against the meta, so it's kind of equivalent in there. This Choco is, a woefully worse card than those other more efficient off finishers, because even though it summons an additional Gura's still got a hefty stock cost, her pay 2 ditch 1 on attack. So being asked even on reverse to pay 3 ditch 1 for an extra instance of 2 damage is a lot to ask when you're taking the game quickly, even if you are free summoning. So it's a lot worse of a package, especially for a deck that wants to take the game a little quickly, even though part of it is answering the meta. Again, I am targeting the Nino boards, but even then, Gura was a deck that really wasn't supposed to care about what its opponent was doing, was meant to be very agnostic. So the fact that we're sort of shifting that way, being more interactive in general, a lot worse of a package, as well as just being more expensive. Other thing you'll notice here is the Mio instead of the Ame. The Mio is that selectivity that we need to make sure that we find those Guras. She does cost stock. Obviously, the Mio is an incredible card, but she is going to increase our overall stock threshold since we're going to have to search out those Guras and grip them early to make sure that we don't lose them. By not playing those Ames, it means that we gimp our access to our climax. One of the best parts about Ame, since she adds cards with soul triggers, is that she could dig to add pants, which you could then in the early game swap into a choice to keep slamming combo or just get you into your finisher climax since Gura doesn't cantrip. She also gave you a little bit of extra deck speed, which you'll notice in this deck, outside of climax combo, we really don't have any. And no, I really don't consider trashing the 2 cards off the Mio to be quote unquote deck speed. Normally you want to leave those clean triggers if you're trying to keep a compressed deck, since you're not always going to be answering board with this version of the deck, but also just generally isn't the kind of deck speed that we want. The other option here, since we're playing this red package at the top that we need a color fix for, is this Miko. I know Riaz personally is a very big fan of this card because it can open up other lanes, since a lot of your other cards in Hololive are very small. But a big part of also losing that Ame, since that Ame was 2,500, means that you don't really have a lot of cards to kill stuff with. So having this Miko sort of sidestepping that by letting your other smaller level zeros, since they can't swing over, you might as well kill another card when Miko kills something and then direct, which is fine, but having this Miko in here means that we lose those 4 additional clock pluses. Part of 1k1 Gura being able to slam those 8 clock pluses, one of them that was also an oversize in the center position, meant that you had all these ways to just keep your hand up to keep slamming. It was resources at any cost to make sure that you were ahead, you were pushing tempo, you were determining how fast the game was going, so that your double Gura at endgame, it didn't even have to push that far to finish the game, since you were slamming your opponent as quickly as you could go. So the fact that we're moving towards this to let our other cards work because we gotta play these filter cards, it's overall a less directed and less solid strategy over the course of many rounds, many repetitions, as I've said before. The other big thing here, obviously, is that having those filter needs in the Sora and this Muna, these 3 additional filter cards we have, Sora to make sure our card doesn't go to clock, and Muna to be able to just helmet things out of our grave, 3 cards to search from deck, 3 cards to pick up from other zones, waiting room and clock, means that we can't run those cheap anti-tech cards that can be really powerful, like that Hato that had the double stun that's really good against standby. That's just a small example. That tech card could really be anything depending on the meta, but in this case, it's just a way to say, look, we had to replace those tech cards and those threat cards like tap counter and the Hato with these extra filter cards where all they do is shore up the fact that we got to death grip our Gura. There's also a very minimal reduction in soul triggers due to having to add these extra filter cards, but that's really not that big of a deal. And the only last thing is that because, again, we're not playing Ame, which could cost us like get into a climax, we are then playing this Luna, which can check X into any climax, just a way to grab something, since, again, we want to keep slamming. And I'm not saying the deck is non-functional by any means. You can absolutely sleeve this up, take it to locals, maybe even sleeve it up and take it to regionals. But we're trying to ruthlessly optimize a deck like this to reach a similar, if not the same power level to when Gura was at 4. And we just can't get to where we were before with this version of the list that Steve won Worlds with, because look at how directed, clean, and simple this is. We can play these cards in super high counts. We don't have to worry about trying to find and death grip cards. We can just naturally play the game, naturally slam down double Gura without even thinking about it, while prioritizing the thing that actually made this deck super strong, which was shoving, and then just tossing down triple Gura and whatever other level 3s just for whatever. Having to death grip throughout the game, dedicate resources and lines to finding these cards, holding these cards, because we can only play 2, will, over the course of many games, 10, 11, 12 rounds in a tournament, start to have bad returns where you're going to lose those games that you otherwise have to win to make it to top at a long event. And again, there's always exceptions. There's always breakout successes. There's always times where you just run hot and you never experience those problems. You always have those 2 Guras and you always slam them down and it's never a problem. But That's not the typical case when you got to play so many rounds, succeed over and over and over again, since Weiss is best of one, super cutthroat and making it all the way through. Introducing that kind of variance into your core strategy is something I'm just not personally comfortable with, and these are all the reasons why. And talking about exceptions as we get into the close, people also love to bring up, why does Rando still top? Rando and D-side is at a limit 2, and it was another deck that only really aimed to put 2 randos at a time onto the board so that they would change, they could heal, you start doing it at level 2. But you got to remember that D-side is a super unique limit 2 because it's more like a limit 6. You have these 4/2/1 randos that are unrestricted that play that 3/2 rando out of memory. And yeah, you got to have the randos in the grave, but D-side has safety net lines for rando that are just absolutely insane. The first part is that they're completely free, and in fact they're resource positive, because when you have the rando markered under the Eru Brainstorm, you can send it at the end of your turn, so you're markering it early from waiting room as early as level 0. That arrow then sits on the back of your board for the entire game until you play a single memory change, in which case you can put it into the bottom of your stock to be paid out at the beginning of your next turn when you play the 2/1, sometimes even with the 2/1's own stock cost. So the fact that you're getting that free stock off the Eru, and that's also the card that's safetying in your rando, not only is that free, that's resource positive. And then again, it's a staple to its most powerful card, the Eru Brainstorm. The Eru Brainstorm's absolutely insane profile, generates you free stock while also being a salvage brainstorm. That also can just like giga compress you into the moon. One of D-side's most insane cards, and it's on the ban list for a reason. There's a reason why it's the one you always pick. And the other big thing is they're unobtrusive to any usual play pattern. Taking a look back at this post-ban Gura list, having to go into these search lines, having to field these cards to otherwise get those Guras to then death grip them is directly adverse to the general strategy of just naturally taking your game as quickly and efficiently as you can. Which is why 1K1 Kali Gura was always so strong. You're always slamming, always going, just to go back to that. The fact that we are doing these other things that are antithetical to our strategy in general for what we're trying to do does just bring down the general consistency and power of the deck. But D-side doesn't have to worry about that, because it doesn't matter what card you actually put in stock off the Eru. That was the line you were going to do anyway as you change your Arias or whatever the hell else you were doing. So the fact that it is completely unobtrusive to its usual play pattern means that D-side can get away with all this stuff. And even so, 8-Pants D-side is still a shadow of its former self. Unbanned D-side is one of the most crazy custom set Weiss stuff I've ever had the pleasure of playing, and my opponents have ever had the displeasure of sitting against. But even then, despite being the most resilient post-ban set to ever do it with a limit 2, it can still fall into those same general pitfalls that we talked about before. Those general resource thresholds increasing, not that big of a deal for D-side. Gripping, sometimes when you have the rando in hand, you got to overplay, take a minus with the Yuri, but we don't really have to have those filter needs. But still, you're going to lose cards to clock, zone loss. That can still be super catastrophic. You get a 3/2 rando stuck in your clock, there's almost nothing you can do about it. And losing that consistency of having 4, just like thinking of something about Kurami, where having 4 means it's easier to put in grave, that can still affect D-side. So even things like that affect the rate at which it tops, but it still does show up because, again, it's one of the most resilient limit 2s to ever do it. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap up here. Thanks for coming along with the ride with me with this one. I hope you guys like these more competitive theory videos. This one's just a little bit more of like kind of a response. Riaz and I were talking about this beforehand, talking about Gura as a limit 2, our thoughts on it, things of that nature. This is just my take. Again, in terms of Weiss-Schwarz play styles and how I approach the game, I'm definitely a very conservative player in terms of how I deck build and how I choose to bring decks to events, especially long ones with many, many rounds. I play for very, very high floors instead of high ceilings when I can, and when that is a good strategy to be doing, which with the way Weiss works is generally a lot of the time. Upcoming content, still trying to get those set reviews ready. Persona 3 Reload and other upcoming sets are things that we have on our radar. some scheduling we have to do there, as well as many more upcoming deck techs. And of course, as we get closer to Worlds, I will be in Japan from mid-April all the way to almost mid-May. So during that time, it's going to be a content lull yet again. Might be able to get Tanner and the rest of the crew to put out some stuff. I know they post some stuff on here from time to time, but I wouldn't count on it, especially with the white stuff they've been still focused on, mostly competing in One Piece and doing very well. And with that, Pittsburgh White Shorts signing off, and we'll see you all in the next one.